What we've seen is that Iran has managed to turn this conflict into the most significant blow against the United States that any country has been able to execute in many decades. Not only does the United States look like it's in the pocket of a much smaller, more kind of unpredictable country, Israel specifically, not only has this separated GCC allies from the United States, the UAE has dropped out of the oil consortium. Not only do we see that the closest Western allies in the world, in Europe, have distanced themselves from the United States. And that's not even counting how America looks at itself through the lens of politics and identity and global leadership. So just simply by surviving, Iran has shown that small can be powerful and that the United States can be overcome, possibly even defeated.
What is going on, everybody? Welcome back to the channel. Today, we're breaking down a conversation that deserves more than just a quick headline. It's a discussion that revisits bold predictions, tests them against what actually happened, and asks an important question. What can we learn when real-world events don't unfold the way people expected? On Piers Morgan's panel, two guests returned to examine the aftermath of the Iran conflict. One is Andrew Bustamante, drawing on his intelligence background. The other is Jiang Xueqin, offering a strategic and analytical perspective. Instead of simply repeating earlier arguments, they're forced to confront how the situation actually unfolded. And here's what makes this conversation worth your time. Pause. It's not just about who was right or wrong. It's about what their exchange reveals regarding military strategy, intelligence assessments, media narratives, and the limits of predicting events in one of the world's most volatile regions. Listen closely, because as the discussion unfolds, you'll hear moments that challenge common assumptions and raise difficult questions about how conflicts are interpreted in real time. Whether you agree with the panel or not, there's a lot to unpack beneath the surface. If you enjoy thoughtful analysis that goes beyond the headlines and examines the facts with context, make sure to subscribe and join the conversation. This community is built on asking better questions, weighing the evidence, and exploring the bigger picture. Stay with me until the end, because the final moments of this discussion put everything you've heard into a completely different perspective. And before we jump in, let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I always enjoy seeing how far this community reaches. Now let's get right into it.
Because if the Ayatollah stands, if the Iranian Republic...
Do you think it was just a case, not of Trump being told what to do, but that of him just buying into this playbook, which then just didn't materialize?
Yeah, I think there's a number of overlapping intelligence issues here. And at the core of it, I see it as an intelligence failure. First of all, the fact that the United States didn't have our own intelligence infrastructure to the point where we could see the holes in Israel's assessments and estimates, that's a major problem. It means that we went into Iran basically following Israel's guidance, following Israel's intelligence, following their targeting packages, instead of our own independent intelligence assessment. Whenever you're in a position like that, you're going in essentially blind, and you're going in kind of like the pit bull on the leash for somebody else. And I think that's what we saw happen very shortly after the promises that Israel made didn't really pan out. Now where we are today is stuck in the same situation, where we still don't have an intelligence network. We still don't have independent intelligence telling us what we can assess and what we can estimate, what we can predict inside Iran. And that's why we're still stuck in this quagmire. We have an MOU that doesn't give us any of the outcomes that we strategically promised the American people. And the MOU isn't working. There's no active cessation of attacks. They've just decreased, they've changed, but it's still happening.
Right, and Professor Jiang, you know, the big goal in the end, which was explained after weeks and weeks of getting nowhere with the others, Donald Trump said, right, this is all about stopping the Iranians having a nuclear weapon. And yet they still got all their enriched uranium. I mean, I think the only way that can ever be got by America or Israel is with ground forces. So I think on that alone, That's clear. But the Iranians have also started talking openly now about the need to build a nuclear weapon, to have one. That actually what this has taught them, if people are wedded to the annihilation of all of their regime, then they need a nuclear weapon to defend themselves. And perversely, it could end up creating a situation where the Iranians actually want to develop something that maybe 3 months ago, 4 months ago, they like to saber rattle about, but weren't actually going to do.
Right. So before the war, the Iranians had a religious fatwa banning the making and use of nuclear weapons. So the Iranians were committed not to building a nuclear weapon. With enriched uranium, Ted Posto, who is an MIT professor, he says that it'll take them exactly 6 weeks to build a nuclear weapon. So if the Iranians had the will, they could build a nuclear weapon. So if they were attacked with a nuclear weapon, then they would respond with at least 10 nuclear weapons. That's how much they can make with their enriched uranium. So it's really a quagmire for the United States. Now, I would say that this reporting that Iran wants to build a nuclear weapon, it's actually false. There is a religious fatwa in place, and it has to be overruled by the new Ayatollah, and that's a very long process. And quite honestly, the Iranians don't really need a nuclear weapon at this stage.
No, I mean, Andrew, the reality is the Strait of Hormuz is proving just as effective as any nuclear deterrent, isn't it? Because everybody knows that Iran still maintains control of that strait and can turn it on and off whenever they feel like. And I'd be astonished, given the long and unillustrious history of this regime, if they didn't use that to maximum leverage effect. Why wouldn't they?
Yeah, you're exactly right. And what we've seen is that Iran has managed to turn this conflict into the most significant blow against the United States that any country has been able to execute in many decades. Not only does the United States look like it's in the pocket of a much smaller, more kind of unpredictable country, Israel specifically, not only has this separated GCC allies from the United States, the UAE has dropped out of the oil consortium. Not only do we see that the closest Western allies in the world, in Europe, have distanced themselves from the United States. And that's not even counting how America looks at itself through the lens of politics and identity and global leadership. So just simply by surviving, Iran has shown that small can be powerful and that the United States can be overcome, possibly even defeated. Because if the Ayatollah stands, if the Iranian Republic continues to persist in Iran in its current form, if we reach the end of this war, what was it all for?
Yeah.
And it shows that they won. And if that doesn't inspire and encourage and maybe even provoke countries like North Korea, Cuba, continue to encourage countries like Russia, China, other adversaries competing for global dominance, I don't know what will.
Although it's interesting, Professor Jiang, to look at what's happened in Ukraine, for example, where everybody assumed the Russians would just run Ukraine over pretty quickly. I think Russia assumed it would do it very quickly. That hasn't happened. And we are many years into that war. And in fact, you could argue Ukraine now is not just putting up a good fight, but is giving Vladimir Putin quite a bloody nose. It's proving to be very costly in both Russian human life and on the economy there. It's an interesting thing to look at and say, well, you look at what's happened there, and it may fly slightly in the face of what Andrew just said, but maybe if you're China, you look at what's happened in Iran. I think there's an opportunity for you there, maybe with Taiwan, or maybe to strengthen ties with Iran, whatever it may be. And at the core of it all is a kind of battle for energy, right? I mean, energy is going to be powering the new arms race, which is AI, and the winner may well take all.
Well, people argue that this war was started in order for America to force the world to buy American energy. Because right now, if you look at the global map, the only reliable source of energy now is the Western Hemisphere, right? Because Russia is losing its war in Ukraine or is facing a stalemate, depending on which side you're on. But the Ukrainians are striking deep into Russian territory and hitting oil refineries, and so it is reducing Russia's capacity to export oil. The Middle East is on fire. Before, Qatar could provide 20% of the world's LNG. Now it's completely offline. So if you're Japan, who do you turn to? You can't turn to Russia. You can't turn to Qatar. You can't turn to the Middle East. So therefore, you're stuck buying energy from America. So you could say that even though America is losing this war in the Middle East, they ultimately will be the big winner because the world is now completely dependent on the Western Hemisphere for resources.
Andrew, what do you think of that?
I think that there's a couple of kind of fundamental, I don't want to call them mistakes, but foundational assessments that we're missing here, right? First of all, comparing what's happening in Iran to what's happening in Ukraine isn't quite a straight analog because the whole world rushed to Ukraine's aid. They received hundreds of billions of dollars, weapons, intelligence support, satellite imagery support, not only from the United States, but from Great Britain, from France, from Germany, from across Europe. So the whole world was required to prevent Russia's progress in Ukraine. And what you see from Zelensky still to this day is the continued request for more support and more money and more training and more everything to continue to prosecute this, what was framed to us as a fight to protect democracy. That's not what we're seeing in Iran. Iran has largely stood on its own strategy and on its own weapons reserves, on its own capabilities. Now, yes, it has tapped into Russian intelligence and it's tapped into very likely Chinese support also, but it has stood on its own 2 feet since we launched that first attack. Not just the United States, but in joint concert with Israel. The 2 most sophisticated militaries in the world attacked Iran, and it's still there.
Here's where the conversation takes a much deeper turn. Because Professor Jiang raises a question that forces people to look beyond the battlefield and into the world of economics, energy, and global power. His argument is that conflicts are not only fought with weapons, they are also shaped by resources, alliances, and economic pressure. Pause. And that raises a bigger question. When nations go to war, who benefits from the consequences that follow? Looking at the global energy market, the disruption of major suppliers can create enormous shifts. Countries dependent on imported energy are suddenly forced to reconsider where they get their resources, who they rely on, and how secure those relationships really are. And this is where the debate becomes more complicated. Because a conflict can have military goals, political goals, and economic consequences. And sometimes those consequences reach far beyond the original battlefield. But then Andrew Bustamante introduces a different perspective, and this is where the discussion changes. He argues that comparing Iran's situation directly to Ukraine's is not a simple comparison. The circumstances are completely different. Ukraine received extensive international support, including weapons, intelligence sharing, and assistance from a broad coalition of allies. Iran, by contrast, operated under very different conditions, relying primarily on its own resources and strategy. And that distinction matters, because understanding a conflict requires looking at the full picture, not just who has the most powerful weapons, but also geography, preparation, alliances, political objectives, and the ability to withstand pressure. Listen closely. This is the part many people miss. A nation's survival after a major confrontation does not automatically prove one side completely won or lost. It reveals something more complicated. Modern conflicts are shaped by resilience, strategy, and unexpected consequences. And that is the uncomfortable lesson from this debate. Power alone does not always determine the outcome. Sometimes the greatest surprise comes when one side underestimates the other. So the question is, did this conflict reveal a failure to understand an opponent's strength? Or does it show how unpredictable modern warfare has become? The biggest lesson from this conflict is that power alone does not always determine the outcome. Strategy, preparation, alliances, and resilience all play a role in shaping what happens next. The real question is whether leaders fully understood the challenges they were facing or underestimated the complexity of the situation. What do you think? Was this a strategic miscalculation or proof that modern conflicts are more unpredictable than they appear? Share your thoughts, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and join us for more analysis beyond the headlines.